Happy holidays everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Tuscany, and today I'm going to show you how I made this holiday-inspired lantern. So grab a cup of tea, some eggnog, or maybe some hot chocolate, and let's get started. The lantern that I got for this project is from Michaels. I originally wanted to get something vintage, like an old style lantern that had been used before. However, vintage is quite expensive nowadays, and I wasn't finding anything in my price range. So I decided just to go for something cheap from Michaels. So the first thing I started on were the trees that I wanted to put inside my lantern. Now I really wanted to do something that was just winter inspired for this. I didn't want it to be too Christmassy or any sort of specific holiday. I just wanted to make it just winter warm and winter warm. It's kind of an oxymoron. But like that warm and cozy kind of like snow outside, fire inside kind of feel. And I wanted it to be more like winter woods. And as I've mentioned in previous videos, I love birch trees, so the trees that I wanted to make for inside the lantern were inspired by that kind of birch tree aesthetic. And to make the trees, I wanted to make them out of mesh wire. I originally thought that I would make them out of wire and then cover them with like paper mache, but they just turned out so beautiful just with the wire itself that I kept it that way. So for the trees, I just started out with some mesh wire. This is something that you can definitely find at your local craft store. And what I did is I cut out just strips of the mesh wire. I later found out that it was actually easier to cut a small section and then actually rip the wire all the way down. But for my first couple of trees, I started out with going through the painstaking task of cutting just like maybe 1/4 of an inch and then having to fold it back and then cutting and then folding, and it was tedious. But if you do get mesh wire, please know that you can actually cut a small bit and then rip it. At least for the mesh wire that I got, that was possible. Once I had my strips of mesh wire, I then wanted to curve them into a tree shape. So I used a paintbrush as a base to start curving around the paintbrush. Once I had some sort of curve going, then I was able to take the paintbrush away and just start curving it myself. Once I had a base of the tree formed, I was able then just to cut away the excess. But it was important to save all the excess wire because I wanted to use that wire to make the branches for the trees. And then once I had all the basic shapes roughly formed, I then went in with some pliers and formed it a bit more to tree shape. It's important to use pliers here because the edges of the mesh wire can be quite sharp. I did cut myself a few times, so if you plan to do this at home, either wear gloves or be more careful than I was. As for the branches, I wanted to make a variety of sizes. So I just took all the excess mesh wire that I had and just started forming small branches. I then intertwined them into the trees and pinched them in with my pliers. Once all the trees were formed, I made a total of 5 with varying heights, sizes, and branches. I then wanted to map out where they were going to go into the lantern. Now the lantern I can't really take apart. It has one small door and that's all I have to work with, which is why I really wanted to plan out exactly where they were going to go once I got it into the lantern. I also wanted to know how much space I had for the house that I was going to make. So what I did is I measured the square of the inside of the lantern and mapped that out in blue tape on my table. I was then able to go in and measure how much space I had for the house once the trees were in place. I knew that I didn't necessarily want to add any holiday decorations, but I wanted some color in my lantern. So I decided to make a barn house that was bright red. I started off with a sketch of the barn house that I wanted. and then I cut out the 4 walls, the roof, and the chimney from mat board. Once that was all ready to go, I then wanted to cut out all the windows. So I measured out exactly where they were going to be and cut them out. If this seems familiar, then you might have seen a lot of these processes in my haunted house video. If you haven't seen my haunted house video, I'll put a link right here. I recommend checking it out because I go into a bit more detail in that video on how to glue and paint wood paneling. So once I had all the windows cut out for my barn, I decided then just to go in and do the wood paneling. This is a little bit different than my haunted house because I did the windows first and then the wood paneling. But since this one is so small, I decided to make it a little bit easier on myself. So I started off texturing some red paper with some black and brown ink. I then went in and cut all the panels for the wood siding. Once I had all my red panels ready to go, I then just went in and glued them on. I didn't worry about covering up the windows because I could go and cut those out later. As you can see, the edges of the windows are a bit rough, but that's alright because I was going to cover them up anyway. So the next step was to add transparent paper over the windows and white trimming on top. I did this by tracing the windows onto some scrap paper, and I labeled them clearly in case any of the windows were oddly shaped, so that they would match up perfectly. Once I had the outlines for my windows, I then overlapped the transparent paper on top and traced them out again. However, when tracing them onto the transparent paper, I wanted to add some width, because I wanted these sheets of transparent paper to be slightly larger than the window itself. Once I had all the windows traced out onto the transparent paper, I then did the same with some white cardstock. Once again, making these slightly wider so that they would cover the transparent paper. Now for the white cardstock, I cut out the centers and left about 1/8 of an inch border around the sides, so that it would create a frame for the windows, all while making sure these were properly labeled and in the right spots. I then went ahead and glued the transparent paper down first onto the corresponding windows, and then the frames. Once the windows and the trimming was glued on, I was then able to put the whole house together, using hot glue, of course. And in order to cover up the white sides of the mat board on the corners of the house, I just covered those with some extra red paneling. While I was at it, I glued the roof to the house and glued the chimney parts together. But I kept the chimney separate because I knew I wanted to put that on after I added the shingles, which was the next step. Because I like to torture myself, I made the shingles a pretty tedious process as well. So for the shingles, I cut out strips of gray paper. I then checkered those strips so that they would overlap and create a beautiful texture. On each strip, I also alternated which squares would be cut out. That way, when the pieces were overlapped, they would create a nice shingled pattern. Once the checkered strip was cut out, I then went in and textured it with a bit of black and brown ink, and then I glued it onto the roof. Once again, making sure that they overlapped and alternated to create that nice texture. This only took me about a day, and I had the company of Name of the Wind on audiobook to keep me going. It was also important for me to save some of the squares that I had cut out so that I could cover up the strips at the very top. And I'm quite happy with how the shingling turned out. I think it looks wonderful. And as you see here, I also added some barn doors to the front and the back of the house. I just did this by cutting out some rectangles of mat board, covering it with red paneling, adding white X's, and then gluing them onto the house itself. I also added a black piece of wire on top to make it look like sliding rails for the barn door. Since I wanted to add snow in my little lantern, I knew that I wanted the house to sit up on top of it a bit so that the snow wouldn't cover it on the bottom. So I just added some stilts to the bottom of the house that I could stand up a little bit higher and the snow could be around it without covering the house itself. Now it was time for my favorite part, the lights. As you may have guessed, I like putting lights in a lot of the things that I make. I think it adds just a really special touch to it. However, I did choose something a little bit difficult for this one, and I cannot say that it wasn't a little bit irritating to get the lights in. So for the lights, I got this awesome 12-foot strand of mini LEDs that I could turn on and off with a remote. I thought the remote was really important because I don't want to have to be reaching into the lantern to continuously be turning it off and possibly hurting my design by doing so. I also want to point out the importance of checking your lights before you put them inside your design, because it's the worst thing when you get a tree decorated or the lights put up on the front of your house or a little miniature house decorated with lights, and then you plug it in and you realize they don't work. It's awful. So don't do that. Always check your lights before you start a project. So once my lights were all checked and they were beautiful and ready to go, I then mapped out where the trees and the house would go inside the lantern. I wanted to put the lights on before I got it into the lantern because, like I said before, it's really hard to work inside the lantern because there's only one small door and you can't dismantle it. And as you may have noticed, the configuration for the trees and the house changed a bit. But that's pretty normal for me because I'm quite terrible at sticking to my plans. Yeah. So once I got the trees and the house planned out to my liking, I then was able to wrap the wire lights around the trees and get it just the way I wanted it. This was not easy. The trees kept moving, and because it's wire, they kept bending different ways and they kept falling over, and the house wouldn't stay in place, and it was quite frustrating. But just be patient, move things the way you need to, and it will turn out beautifully in the end. So now it was time to move everything into the lantern. I started by getting the trees and getting them all clumped together and gently maneuvering them into the lantern. Because of my previous configuration on the table, I knew exactly where each tree was meant to go. So I just went ahead and glued those down with some hot glue. Once they were all glued down, I could then tweak the branches and make sure everything was the way I wanted it. And I hid the battery box underneath the house. The last thing was to put the stuffing in and make all the beautiful snow on the ground. And that was it. My beautiful winter wonderland was done. I could close the door and light it up. So what do you think? Are you going to try something like this? Let me know down in the comments below. And if you like this video, give it a big thumbs up. And if you're interested in more videos like this, then please subscribe. Happy holidays to all you wonderful folk, and I'll see y'all next time. It's really hard to lift my arm in this dress.